Greetings, parasite ecologists. One of the exciting things about the nematodes is that they are experimental workhorses. A lot of really awesome science has been done using nematode parasites, and that science has shed light on how parasites operate generally, well beyond the phylum Nematoda. Let's see what the nematodes have to teach us about the fundamental principles of parasite ecology. Now, when a host is confronted with a parasitic infection, there are a bunch of things that it can do to counter its parasite. The first is that the host can try to avoid the infectious stages. That means just not coming into contact with the parasite, closing the exposure filter as much as possible to prevent infection before it happens. Assuming that's impossible and the host does have to face infection, it's possible for the host to then compensate for the pathological effects of infection. It might also be able to limit the number of parasites that can establish. We're going to talk about each of these three processes individually through lessons taught to us by the nematodes. Let's begin with avoiding infectious stages. One of the strategies that many host species have evolved to avoid infectious stages is the behavior of migration. Those recurring, round-trip movements that many animal species make, including birds, mammals, and even insects. Sure, there are lots of reasons to migrate, avoiding cold winter conditions, finding food, but nematode parasites are thought to be the ultimate reason for the migratory nature of at least some host species. Migration is a pretty cool trick because hosts can avoid parasite stages by getting out of a place that they've inhabited for a long period of time. People first realize this through their experiences with farming animals. Consider, for example, animals that we keep in pasture lands, like sheep. Sheep are infected by lots of different nematode species, and farmers have struggled for 10,000 years with keeping nematode parasites out of sheep guts because nematodes reduce the returns that you get on sheep's milk, wool, and meat. What happens with these nematode parasites is that the eggs of the nematodes build up in pastures, particularly where host density is really high. Obviously, we like to keep animals at high density because we like to make a lot of milk, wool, and meat. We want to get greater profits from our farming enterprises. Of course, increasing host density makes parasite transmission easier, which means more parasites, which means lower profits, not what the farmer wants. But way back in the early days of agriculture, farmers figured out a way around these worms. If farmers circulated their sheep to different pastures, they could short-circuit the nematode life cycle. Basically, they'd keep sheep in one pasture for a while, but once too many nematode eggs had built up in the soil, they'd move them to another pasture. And while that first pasture was lying fallow, all the nematode eggs would hatch, and without hosts, the larvae would die. Then it would be safe to bring the sheep back into that original pasture. The thinking here is that by moving these animals out of a place where they've built up a reservoir of infectious stages of nematodes by pooping out nematode eggs all over this pasture land, you can get a reduction in the burden of nematodes in your sheep. Human farmers figured this out by trial and error, and wild hosts figured it out through natural selection. Migration might have evolved in wild populations as a way to deal with this same reality. The longer you spend in a place, the more parasites you're pooping out into it. You've got to flee that contaminated habitat until all the parasites die out, and only then is it safe to return. It might be that migration behavior is a defense against the accumulation of parasites, a way to avoid parasite infectious stages. And sure enough, this effect, which was first figured out in nematode parasites in agricultural systems, can be observed in other parasite groups in the wild. You might be familiar with the monarch butterfly, a beautiful North American insect with bright orange and black wings. Some monarchs undertake very long migrations, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles to get from their winter to their summer habitats and back again. But did you know that monarchs are being stalked by a tiny killer? This is a protozoan parasite called Ophriocistus electroscira, which causes monarch wings to become deformed and which can ultimately kill their host. In this photo, the tiny ovals are the parasite's spores. The larger ovals are actually the scales from the monarch butterfly wings. This parasite is transmitted from one monarch to another, and it causes awful pathology of the wings, which makes it impossible for the monarchs to fly and ends up killing them. It's thought that migration might be an adaptation that the monarchs use to ensure that they leave behind habitats that have become contaminated with the spores of this protozoan parasite. Migration lets the monarchs move on to greener pastures where there's less of a risk of parasitism. By the time they come back to their original habitat at the end of the breeding season, hopefully, all the infectious stages of that parasite are dead and no longer infectious. Some intriguing evidence for this comes from a natural experiment. There are 3 monarch populations in the United States. One is a West Coast population that lives west of the Rocky Mountains and migrates into California to breed. Another is an East Coast population east of the Rockies that migrates all the way down to Mexico to breed, a much longer migration. And finally, there's a teeny tiny little population at the southern tip of Florida that does no migration whatsoever. And this sets us up with a really nice natural experiment to test whether our prediction that the migratory population would experience lower parasitism is borne out. Now remember, this is just a natural experiment, right? We didn't randomly assign the treatments, so we can't be confident that this is a causal relationship. But natural experiments can be really powerful ways to look for associations in nature with all of the biological realism that we could ever want and at huge scales of time and space that are just not scales at which you could ever do an actual randomized experiment. So let's see if our prediction is borne out. Here on the x-axis, we have the year between 1968 and 1997, a nice long time series of infection by this protozoan parasite. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of monarch individuals who are heavily infected with Ophriocistus electroschira, our protozoan parasite. Here are our long-distance migrators who are east of the Rocky Mountains, and you can see that their infection prevalence is pretty low, around 0 for most years. Here are the short-distance migrators west of the Rockies, and they have about a 30% infection prevalence. And then in green are the non-migratory population who have extremely high infection rates. This is some correlational evidence that suggests migration might help these monarch butterflies escape their parasites, leaving behind those protozoans. By the time they return to their habitat the next year, hopefully, all of those protozoan parasites have died out. And they can start over again afresh with a low burden of parasitism. So here we have an example where migration is potentially a good way for hosts to avoid the infectious stages of the parasite. This ties into an idea called the Red Queen hypothesis, which hypothesizes that there is a co-evolutionary arms race between hosts and parasites, where hosts are constantly avoiding and parasites are constantly pursuing. It's called the Red Queen hypothesis after the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. If you remember that story, you'll remember that the Red Queen says, "Now here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that." In this sense, coevolution means that even just to stay at your same level of fitness as a host, you need to be running at least as fast as your parasite, because parasites are constantly evolving to pursue you. For example, maybe the host evolves this migration behavior to leave its parasites behind. But in response, parasites might evolve shorter generation times so that their babies can hop on board hosts before they depart on their migration. In response to that, maybe the host leaves for its migration even earlier. And in response to that, the parasite evolves even shorter generation times. And so on forever, with hosts constantly avoiding and parasites constantly pursuing. Now that's how hosts can counter the effects of parasitism by avoiding infectious stages, something that we see among the nematodes and lots of other parasites. Next time, we'll talk about how hosts can compensate for the pathological effects of being infected by parasites. And once again, that's a lesson that the nematodes are going to teach us. I'll see you in the next video.